All right, thanks, Ed. Yeah, I want to start with this, which is that there's been some brave talk recently that essentially the green shoots of recovery are appearing. That the world economy is perhaps not in quite as bad a state as it was, that the corner has been turned, that things are going to be okay, really. And if we're going to start anywhere, let's start with putting any thought that any plausible prospects for recovery in the developed world, so in the UK, in Europe, in North America, is really at this point in time on the cards. That's the starting point for this. So any nonsense at the moment that the carefully massaged unemployment figures in the US are somewhat less bad than they might have been, or that perhaps business investment in Britain has not collapsed quite as far as it might have done, and therefore the economy is turning a corner, just forget it for the time being. This isn't going to happen. There are no plausible reasons to expect a recovery appearing in developed capitalism anytime soon, and of course there are several looming threats on the horizon. The collapse of what appears to be a large property bubble in Chinese cities, for instance, the continuing stagnation in Europe, stagnation turning into outright recession in Europe. So forget any idea that things are going to get better anytime soon. I mean, we can construct implausible reasons why this might happen, but no plausible reasons, and that's the starting point for it. Essentially, we're still living under the shadow of the financial crisis of 2008, and that is how we can start to understand what's taking place here. That's cast a very long shadow, and will continue to cast a long shadow, the epicenter of which, the bulk of which, falls in Europe. And it falls in Europe for a very particular set of reasons which I'll come back to, and it falls hardest onto Greece. Now, people will have seen, just in the last few weeks, that a new bailout deal, not just a bailout deal, but a bailout deal connected to a writing off of Greece's immense public debt has now been constructed, is now in place, that Greece's various creditors have, after a certain amount of negotiation, which shades into outright bribery, agreed to write off some of Greece's debt because it's been finally recognised, after 18 months of flapping about by various international institutions, the IMF, the EU amongst them, Greece's debt is basically unsustainable, and therefore some of it will have to be written off. And so everything will be fine, except of course it won't be, because precisely the problem with the debt write-off in Greece that has taken place is precisely the problem we've faced since 2008. Again, I'll return to this. And the problem that we've faced since 2008 is that a crisis of private finance, a crisis in banks that are privately owned, that are part of private capitalism, is producing a crisis of public debt, and it is then expected that the public side of capitalism, the states, ultimately the taxpayers, will carry the costs of trying to fix a private crisis. And that's exactly what's happened with the Greek debt write-off. The write-off is not sufficiently big to stabilise the Greek economy. On the massively optimistic forecasts that the IMF and the EU produce, Greece's debt will still hit somewhere between 140 and 160% of its GDP by 2020. This cannot, in any sense, be considered a stabilisation. It means that in a few months' time, we can expect another round of debt crises connected to Greece taking place, which means that we're going to be back, as we have been for the last 18 months, shading into 2 years, in continual rounds of crises inside Europe, and that means that the crisis in general is not ended for capitalism. Its epicentre continues to be Europe, and obviously for the UK, deeply connected to the European economy, with 40% of UK exports going into Europe, with just down the road from here an immense concentration of financial wealth and power deeply integrated into what happens in Europe. It means, of course, we're exposed to this, as is everybody else. So capitalism is not, by any sense of any stretch of the imagination, out of the woods yet, and I'll argue in a bit why I don't think it realistically will be. So what happened? 2008 looks like this. People will remember the bankruptcy of Lehman Brothers, at the time the world's third largest investment bank, filed for bankruptcy on the 15th of September 2008. By the end of the following week, the entire global financial system had essentially ground to a halt. There is an extraordinary story in Andrew Rawnsley, who's a sort of terrible Blairite journalist, writes for the Observer, but he wrote an account of Gordon Brown's time in office. I forget the name, but there is a story where he describes on the Sunday after the collapse of Lehman Brothers the heads of the 4 or 5 biggest banks in the UK coming in to see Alistair Darling, who was Chancellor of the Exchequer at the time, and basically saying, as a result of the collapse of Lehman Brothers, all the bad debts, all the bad risks we built up are starting to unwind. And this is on a Sunday evening. And if you don't bail us out, if you don't prop us up, on Monday morning we'll have to close all our branches and shut down all the ATM machines. So the government at this point in time here bails out the banks. This is the process of the bailouts. It uses its own capacity to borrow and to support the private financial system to prop the thing up. The cost of this is immense. About £300 billion straight away just handed over, and about £1.3 trillion just from the UK offered in indirect support. To put that in perspective, it's very, very hard to. £1.3 trillion is the same as everything produced in the entire country for a year. It's about the same as fighting the Second World War for 2 years, put it that way. It's an immense sum of cash just handed over to prop up what was a catastrophic failure of the private banking system. A failure based on, and if people remember Paul Mason's little description of this morning, based on the accumulation of bad debt, based on the previous 10 years of a process in which consumer spending was supposed to drive capitalism onwards, but wages were supposed to be stagnant, and if you look at the data, of course they were. Real incomes in this country did not move. And to make that happen, you're pushing down on wages, but you want people to buy more stuff, you load them up with debt, which of course is unsustainable. Eventually the debt has to be repaid. Eventually the banks start making so many bad loans that some of them start to turn bad. This is precisely what happened at the end of the boom with the collapse of subprime mortgage lending in the US. These are mortgages given to some of the very poorest people in US society by complete cowboys, by cowboy lenders essentially. People who, in many cases, would have no job, would have no income, would have no other assets, but they were nonetheless still given a mortgage. There was no prospect of ever really repaying these mortgages, and so they started to default. When those defaults happened, the financial system was so fragile at this point, it labelled itself with so much debt that the whole thing started to unwind. And it unwound so far that Lehman Brothers files for bankruptcy, we get the process of bailouts. Those bailouts take place right away across the developed world. Critically, what they do is stabilise the situation. We don't get a total disintegration of capitalism at this point. But as well as stabilising it, or the method of stabilising it, is to transfer the crisis onto the public balance sheet. You take a crisis in private finance, in private capitalism, and you shove it into the public sector. And that's why you get the emergence of the sovereign debt crisis, of this massive escalation in the debt that governments now hold. It is the direct result of the financial crash of 2008. It is absolutely not the result of previously excessive spending by governments. We do not get a financial crash. You do not get a debt crisis simply because you built too many schools and hospitals, paid for too many teachers. We got this crash because, and we got this debt crisis because the private financial system failed in spectacular style. And it has its worst impact inside the Eurozone because the Euro itself is a deeply dysfunctional set of relationships. It is an attempt to cobble together a load of very, very disparate economies, very disparate as Greece and Germany, push them all into one box, say they're all going to run the same monetary policy, they're all going to try and control their fiscal spending, they're all going to be forced together to trade using this euro, and then kind of let the whole thing rumble onwards. For 10 years, it kind of boomed. Those 10 years develop enormous imbalances inside the euro, which cannot be competed away because the exchange rate inside Euroland is essentially fixed. Massive imbalances in which Germany and Northern Europe runs up a huge trade surplus against a massive deficit run in Southern Europe. When that imbalance hits the financial crisis, the whole system explodes. And that's why you get the epicenter of the continuing crisis that we're now in built into the structure of the Eurozone. That's why the financial crisis that is the result of this boom in consumer credit, the development of debt, the colossal expansion of borrowing over the 10 years or more leading up to 2008, turning into, because of the bailouts, turning into a crisis of sovereign debt, and because of the bad structure of the euro itself, focused uniquely heavily on what's happening in the Eurozone, with a particular point of contention in Greece, but of course also Portugal, Ireland, Spain and Italy, as Barbara has described. That all of these countries suddenly find themselves overburdened with an incredible amount of debt. So that's one part of it. The effects of this and the response of governments in the developed world is to say we've created a massive amount of public debt, we have to get rid of the debt as fast as possible. This is the process of austerity. Now the critical thing about austerity, this idea that you get rid of debt by cutting as fast as possible, is it is completely self-defeating. It is self-defeating for reasons that have been known. You know, you don't have to be a radical economist of any sort to know this. That have been known. It is part of the mainstream of economic theory that have been known at least since the 1930s, well described by the great liberal economist John Maynard Keynes. And it's quite simple. If you have an economy in recession or a stagnant economy, the government cuts its spending, that means that demand falls. If demand falls, firms sell less. If firms sell less, they cut wages, they lay off workers. People who've been laid off or see their wage falling don't buy as much, so demand falls further. The recession worsens. It's a vicious circle. And that vicious circle is precisely what austerity is now developing inside Europe and frankly developing inside the UK or anywhere else it's applied. You can see it most graphically in Greece. The Greek debt crisis erupts in, essentially in October 2009, the election of a new government there, the PASOK government of, I forget the Prime Minister's name off the top of my head, the PASOK government elected in October 2009, opens the books, realises that the previous government had been basically fiddling its figures, with the connivance, by the way, of Goldman Sachs, fiddling its figures, says the situation is worse than we thought in terms of the amount of public debt we have, we're going to have to do something about this. They then immediately invite Goldman Sachs to try and advise them how to deal with the crisis that Goldman Sachs helped create, and this is the kind of the win-win that the financial system specialises in sometimes. But the response to this was to say, right, we'll go for austerity. From 2009 onwards. At the time, Greece's debt to GDP, debt to output ratio was 130%. So debt was 130% of everything the economy made in a year. It's big. It's much bigger than here because it's about 80% in the UK. That's at the start of the process. Wind forward 18 months, after increasing austerity that has been socially devastating. Just take one example. Greece used to have one of the lowest suicide rates in Europe. Suicides in Greece have increased 40% over the last year. This is a social consequence of austerity, but the economic consequence is that you push the entire economy into a massive, catastrophic recession, and because the economy isn't growing, the relative burden of debt increases. 130% debt to GDP ratio at the end of 2009. Here we are in 2012, it's about 160, 170% of GDP. The debt has increased, in other words, relative to what the economy can bear, because of austerity. Austerity is totally self-defeating. And the fact that you have governments now everywhere pursuing this is one of the reasons why there are no realistic prospects for recovery in the short term. If you have governments committed to taking battered economies, to taking weak economies, stagnant economies like the UK, which is high unemployment, exceptionally high for the UK youth unemployment, and then ripping demand out of the economy means you don't get any recovery. So I think one of the things we ought to be saying, we have to be quite clear about this, is that we say stop the cuts, not just because we know what the social consequences are of imposing massive spending cuts. We know about families that are going to be forced out of their homes. We know about disabled people not going to be allowed, not being able to even survive on the pittance they're now going to be able to get. We know about the social consequences, but the economic consequences for everyone, for absolutely everyone, is that nothing happens, nothing moves, unemployment remains high, there's no realistic prospects of any sort of recovery. That's one part of it. The second part of it is that in order to get austerity to work, you find that people don't really like it very much after a while. They'll accept it to start with because you tell them there's no possible alternative, and then after a while they realise just how bad things get. And of course, it's what's happening in Greece, it's what's happening anywhere where people have really tried to impose austerity. And that means in turn that you have to say, well, you're not going to be allowed, therefore, to decide whether this should be imposed because we want to run the austerity. We want to make sure that creditors are repaid. The issue here is that you're privileging what the financial markets want ahead of any real economic activity. We're saying the most important thing is to repay the debt and we'll forget everything else, we just have to do this. To try and ram that through, you start to see a wind back on democracy itself. So you see in the case of Italy, Mario Monti, no one elected him. I mean, at the time I think lots of Italians thought, good that we got rid of Berlusconi, which I think is understandable, but no one elected Monti. No one elected Papadimos, the new Greek Prime Minister. There is serious talk, by the way, from people like Wolfgang Schäuble, the German finance minister, of suspending the Greek elections because so many people are likely to vote for parties opposed to austerity, opposed to the IMF and the EU. And what an extraordinary pass we come to, where a German finance minister is choosing to tell Greeks whether or not they're allowed to have an election to decide how their country's run. What you get is a winding down of democracy itself. So I think we're in an incredibly serious situation at the moment, because if there's two things, really, that the Labour, progressive, workers' movements have won in Europe since the Second World War, it is the welfare state, which is being hammered by austerity, and it is parliamentary democracy, which is being hammered as a consequence of trying to chase austerity. So there's a real sense of winding back, a real sense of a deep, embedded crisis that will continue for as long as capitalism carries on stagnating. And there are, of course, good reasons to suppose that it will continue to stagnate in two parts. I think one of them is that there are clear and emerging physical barriers to the ability of capitalism to grow. That things like peak oil, like the rising price of commodities, like the fact that in order to develop any kind of growth, capitalism eats up raw resources at an incredible pace, starts to turn into a real barrier to further growth. The second one is something that Karl Marx pointed out 150 years ago, and basically describes a process of capitalism aging as it develops, as the offices and the infrastructure and the factories are made, as the institutions are created to run those things, they become a barrier to further accumulation. You have to try and get rid of what you've already done to unleash a sort of dynamic inside capitalism. And if you take the old bits of capitalism, like the UK, one of the oldest, but including Europe, including the US, for 20, 30, 40 years now, you can see it slowing down. You can see the figures, that it isn't growing as fast as it once used to. There's a slow, slow grind taking place as capitalism ages. So that is a reason to start to think that stagnation is, without us intervening in this process, is a serious prospect. And if there is continual stagnation, then there is a serious issue that both the welfare states that we've grown up with and the democracy that we've grown up with are under continual pressure. Because if capitalism stagnates, you start from going from an argument about, hey, the pie's this size and we take a slice as capitalists and you as everybody else take a slice as workers. You go from an argument about, but it's okay because the pie's growing, so that doesn't matter. The pie stops growing, we start to argue about the slices. And at least partly what's taking place at the moment is they're saying they need to make that slice bigger. And that means eating away at what we have. So in other words, politics becomes more aggressive, more confrontation, because capitalism is stagnating. And the critical thing, I think, for us, out of all of this, is to say, first, stop the cuts. Absolutely. On the basis they ruin people's lives, they destroy communities, but it wrecks entire economies. It is the thing that blights everybody's future. But the second part of that is that we must also defend democracy, defend the gains that people have fought for and won, because they are being pushed back on. And the third part is that we need an alternative to this. We cannot live in a system based on competitive accumulation, based on a continual drive for growth at the expense of everything else. We have to look for an alternative to that. And that's where I think an argument for a radical alternative that I would call socialism, starts to become apparent. So that's three things. Stop the cuts, build a movement to stop the cuts, defend democracy, but also argue for the alternative. Thank you.